The councilman didn't even let her finish the sentence. She was 3 slides into a presentation she had spent 6 months building. A land use proposal for a 4-block corridor in a neighborhood that city planners had ignored for 30 years. She had the data. She had the community signatures. She had the legal descriptions of every parcel on the block. What she did not have in that moment was the microphone. Councilman Gerald Pitt leaned into his microphone, reading glasses sliding down his nose, and said, in front of a chamber full of people, in front of 2 local television cameras, in front of a reporter from the city's largest daily newspaper, that her proposal was, and these are the words that made the transcript, aspirational at best. He moved to table it without a vote. The room shifted. Some people in the gallery exhaled. A few shook their heads. The reporter's pen moved. Simone Achebe-Ward stood at that microphone and did not flinch. Because 3 weeks before that moment, her firm had quietly closed on 11 of the 15 parcels on that block. The zoning he just tabled was for her own property, and the press release was already written. Stay with this, because what happened next, and what happened the morning after, is one of the most quietly devastating reversals you will ever hear about in a public chamber. The Delmore corridor had been on the city's deferred maintenance list for 11 consecutive years. That is not a metaphor. That is a line item, or rather, the consistent absence of a line item, in 11 consecutive municipal budgets. The 4-block stretch running along Delmore Avenue in the city's East Side district had seen 3 separate revitalization task forces convened, 3 sets of recommendations submitted, and 3 rounds of recommendations quietly shelved. The buildings along it were a mix of vacant commercial storefronts, 2 operating corner stores, a barber shop that had been there since 1987, and a scattering of residential units above ground floor retail. The kind of mixed-use bones that urban planners call naturally occurring and developers call opportunity, depending on who is in the room. The neighborhood surrounding it was predominantly black. Had been since the post-war era, when redlining drew the invisible walls that shaped where families could buy and where they could not. The East Side had never been formally redlined on a government map. The city's legal team was careful about that distinction. But the lending patterns, the infrastructure investment gaps, and the zoning classifications told the same story that maps told elsewhere. You did not need a red line on paper when you had a pattern that lasted 70 years. Simone Achebe-Ward had grown up 4 blocks from Delmore Avenue. She knew what the corridor was. She also knew what it could be, not because she had romanticized it, but because she had spent 20 years as a licensed urban planning consultant studying exactly these kinds of corridors in cities across the country. She had her master's degree in urban and regional planning from a program that put her in the field before it put her in a classroom. She had consulted on mixed-use redevelopment projects in 3 other states. She had sat in rooms like the one she would eventually stand in front of Gerald Pitt, and she had watched proposals live and die based on who was presenting them and who was sitting on the dais. She knew the game. She had decided to change the board. Her firm, Achebe-Ward Community Development LLC, had been incorporated for 6 years. It was not a large firm, it was a precise one. She worked with a small team, Nadia Cross as chief of staff and legal counsel, 2 junior planners, and a network of community partners she had spent years building. The firm's philosophy was simple and almost stubbornly unglamorous. Identify undervalued corridors in disinvested neighborhoods, build community consensus around a land use vision, secure the properties quietly, then bring the zoning proposal to the table from a position of ownership rather than aspiration. That last part was deliberate. She had watched too many community-driven proposals get dismissed as wishful thinking by people who had no stake in whether the neighborhood thrived. She had decided that the next time she walked into a council chamber, she would not be asking for permission to dream. She would be asking for a zoning designation on land she already held. The Delmore corridor was going to be that project. But first, she had to buy it, without anyone knowing why. Real estate acquisitions, when done correctly, are almost invisible. That is not an accident. It is strategy. The moment a buyer's identity becomes known in a target corridor, prices move. Sellers who are ready to deal at fair market value suddenly discover that their property is worth more than they thought. Neighbors who had no opinion on the vacant lot next door suddenly have very strong feelings about who should own it. Brokers appear, competing offers materialize. What was a straightforward transaction becomes a negotiation that can stretch for months and sometimes collapse entirely. Simone had seen this happen to other developers. She had watched community-minded buyers get priced out of their own target neighborhoods because word got out too early. She was not going to let that happen on Delmore. Nadia Cross had spent the better part of 18 months building the acquisition structure. The firm used a series of single-purpose LLCs, standard practice in commercial real estate, perfectly legal and deliberately unremarkable. Each entity had a neutral name. Each closing was handled by a different title company. The purchases were spread across a 14-month window so that no cluster of transactions would trigger curiosity at the county recorder's office. The prices paid were fair, not predatory, not inflated. Simone had made a point of that. Every seller was represented by their own counsel. Every transaction was arm's length and clean. Parcel by parcel, quietly, the block came together. By the time Simone stood at that podium, her firm held title to 11 of the 15 parcels on the primary block, approximately 70% of the corridor's developable footprint. The remaining 4 parcels included the barbershop, which she had no intention of displacing, and 3 residential units whose owners she had already been in conversation with about long-term leaseback arrangements that would let them stay in place through any development. She was not proposing to tear the neighborhood down. She was proposing to build it up, with the people who had been there, not over them. The community land trust component of her proposal would have kept a portion of the residential units permanently affordable. The ground floor commercial spaces were designed for local business incubation, with below-market lease rates for East Side entrepreneurs in the first 5 years. She had the financing committed. She had the community signatures, over 400 of them, gathered over 8 months of neighborhood meetings. She had the architectural renderings. She had the legal descriptions of every parcel tied to the zoning request. What she did not yet have was the zoning designation. That was the one thing she still needed from the city, and Gerald Pitt was the man who chaired the subcommittee that controlled it. Gerald Pitt had served on the city council for 14 years. In that time, he had chaired the zoning subcommittee for 9 of them, a tenure that gave him what political observers in the city described, with varying degrees of admiration and frustration, as institutional memory. What that phrase meant in practice depended on who you asked. To the developers who worked with him, it meant he understood the process and could move things when he wanted to. To the community advocates who had sat across the table from him, it meant he knew exactly which levers to pull to slow things down when he chose not to move them. The East Side was not a district that had benefited much from Gerald Pitt's institutional memory. In 9 years chairing the zoning subcommittee, Pitt had approved 17 significant mixed-use development projects in the city. 14 of them were located west of the river, in districts that were predominantly white and already well-resourced. 2 were in the Midtown corridor, 1 was in the north side, none were in the east side. This was not technically discrimination. That was the word Pitt's staff would use if anyone raised the pattern. Technically, each proposal had been evaluated on its individual merits. Technically, the East Side proposals that had been tabled or rejected had procedural deficiencies, or insufficient community engagement documentation, or financing contingencies that hadn't been fully resolved, or some other reason that was technically legitimate. Technically. What the record also showed, and this was something Simone had spent considerable time studying before she ever filed a single piece of paperwork, was that Pitt's subcommittee had a pattern of tabling proposals from community-based developers in disinvested neighborhoods at a rate significantly higher than proposals from established commercial developers with existing city relationships. She knew who she was dealing with. She had built her entire strategy around that knowledge. The question was never whether Pitt would try to dismiss her. The question was what the dismissal would look like when it arrived, and whether it would arrive before or after the world knew what she already owned. She had timed it very carefully, but there was one variable she had not fully accounted for: how publicly and how completely Gerald Pitt would humiliate himself. The evening before the council session, Simone sat in the firm's office until past 11. Nadia had gone home at 9 after they had run through the presentation 3 times. The slides were clean. The parcel documentation was organized in the portfolio in the exact order she would need it. The financing commitment letters were tabbed. The community signature packets were bound and labeled. She had prepared for every question she could anticipate and a few she hoped wouldn't come. What she was doing at 11 o'clock was not preparation. It was something quieter than that. She was reading the names, the signature list from the neighborhood meetings, 437 names. People who had shown up to church basements and community center folding chairs and a Saturday morning session at the barbershop, the one on the corner that had been there since 1987, the one she had specifically structured the deal to protect, and had signed their names to say that they wanted this, that they believed the corridor could be something, that they were willing to trust someone who had grown up 4 blocks away and come back with a plan. She had not told them about the acquisitions yet. That was deliberate too. She had wanted the community engagement to be genuine, not shaped by the knowledge that the developer presenting the vision was also the one who had quietly purchased most of the block. She wanted their input to be real. She had incorporated 31 specific changes into the proposal based on what she had heard in those meetings. She closed the portfolio at 11:15 and sat for a moment in the quiet. She was not nervous about the presentation. She was nervous about something smaller and harder to name. The particular weight of walking into a room where you know you will not be given the benefit of the doubt, where you will have to be twice as precise and twice as composed as anyone else at the table, and where the outcome may have nothing to do with the quality of your work. She had been in rooms like that before. She picked up her portfolio, turned off the desk lamp, and went home. The press release was already in Nadia's drafts folder, scheduled to send at 6 the following morning, the morning after the council session, win or lose. She had written it that way on purpose. The session was scheduled for 7 o'clock. By 6:45, the gallery was nearly full. This was unusual. Zoning subcommittee sessions were not, as a rule, events that drew crowds. They were procedural exercises attended mostly by the applicants, their counsel, a handful of affected neighbors, and the occasional local reporter who had nothing more urgent to cover. Gerald Pitt had chaired hundreds of them in 9 years, and the gallery had been full perhaps a dozen times. It was full tonight because Simone's community partners had done their work. The 437 people who had signed the petition had been notified. The neighborhood association had sent a reminder. The barbershop had a handwritten sign in the window. Word had moved the way word moves in close communities, person to person, with the particular urgency of people who have been told their neighborhood doesn't matter and have decided to show up and disagree. 2 local television cameras were set up on tripods along the side wall. A reporter from the city paper sat in the press row with a notebook open. Simone arrived at 6:50 with Nadia beside her. She wore the charcoal blazer. She carried the leather portfolio. She took her seat at the applicant table and set the portfolio down and did not look around the room, because looking around the room was the kind of thing that made you feel the weight of what was at stake, and she needed to feel only the work. Nadia leaned close and said 2 words, "We're ready." Simone nodded once. Gerald Pitt entered at 6:58, shuffling papers, reading glasses already on his nose. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at the applicant table. He sat down, adjusted his microphone, and said something to the council member beside him that made them both chuckle quietly. He had not, as far as Simone could tell, read the packet she had submitted. She had submitted it 45 days prior, the full application with parcel documentation, financing commitments, community engagement records, and architectural drawings. 45 days. It was sitting in a binder at the dais, and from where she sat, it appeared to be unopened. She had anticipated this too. She opened her portfolio and waited. She had been given 10 minutes. She used the first 90 seconds on context, the 11 years on the deferred maintenance list, the 3 failed task forces, the infrastructure gap data. She kept her voice level and her pace deliberate. She was not performing urgency. She was building a record. The second slide showed the community engagement numbers: 437 signatures, 31 proposal modifications based on resident input, 8 months of neighborhood meetings. She had the dates, the locations, the attendance figures. The third slide was the parcel map. She was 3 sentences into explaining the map. Specifically, she was explaining the land trust component and how it would preserve long-term affordability for existing residents when Gerald Pitt leaned into his microphone. He did not raise his hand. He did not wait for a pause in her presentation. He simply leaned forward, and his voice came through the chamber speakers with the particular ease of a man who has interrupted people in this room for 9 years and has never once been asked to stop. "Ms. Ward," he said, not Achebe-Ward, just Ward, the truncation small enough to be deniable and large enough to be felt. "I'm going to stop you there." The room went very still. "We appreciate the presentation," he said, in the tone of someone who does not appreciate the presentation. "But what you're describing here, the land trust structure, the mixed-use rezoning, the community financing model, this is, and I want to be fair to you, aspirational at best." He paused to let that land. "The corridor you're referencing has significant title complexity. There are multiple ownership interests, there are infrastructure liabilities, and frankly, the financing picture you've outlined here doesn't reflect the realities of what it takes to move a project of this scale in this city." He picked up the binder, the 45-day-old binder, and set it back down without opening it. "I'm going to move to table this proposal pending a more complete application. We can revisit in the next cycle." He looked at the council member beside him. "Do I have a second?" The second came. It took less than 4 seconds. Simone stood at the microphone. She did not sit down. She did not gather her papers in the quick, flustered way of someone who has been dismissed and knows it. She stood with her hand resting flat on the portfolio and looked at the dais with steady, dark eyes. "Councilman," she said, "I'd like to note for the record that the application packet submitted 45 days ago addresses each of the concerns you've raised. I'd ask that the packet be entered into the official record before the motion is finalized." Pitt waved a hand. "It'll be in the record. Motion carries." And that was it. 10 minutes, 3 slides, and a gavel. The reporter's pen was moving. The gallery did not erupt. This is worth saying because in stories like this one, the gallery often erupts. People stand up, voices rise, someone says something that gets quoted in the next day's paper. That is one kind of moment. This was a different kind. The gallery went quiet in the particular way that communities go quiet when something happens that they have seen before. Not shock exactly, but the heavy recognition of a pattern repeating. The older woman in the front row, who had been coming to Eastside neighborhood meetings since before Simone was born, closed her eyes for a moment. The man beside her put a hand on her arm. Nadia Cross wrote something in her notebook and did not look up. What she wrote was a single word underlined twice. Perfect. Not because what had just happened was acceptable. It was not. Not because the dismissal was fair. It was not. But because Gerald Pitt had just done, on camera, in front of a packed chamber and a working journalist, exactly what Simone had told Nadia he would do, and he had done it without reading the packet, without opening the binder, and without knowing the first thing about who he was actually talking to. The reporter from the city paper was writing fast. She had come to this session expecting a routine zoning hearing. What she had instead was a councilman cutting off a presenter mid-sentence, dismissing a 45-day-old application he visibly hadn't read, and moving to table a community proposal in front of 400 community members and 2 television cameras. That was already a story. She did not yet know it was going to be a much bigger one. Simone collected her portfolio from the podium, walked back to the applicant table, and sat down beside Nadia. The session moved on to the next item on the agenda, a routine variance request for a parking structure in the West Side District, which Pitt approved in under 3 minutes. Simone did not stay for the rest of the session. She and Nadia walked out through the gallery, past the community members who had come to support her, nodding to each of them without stopping. Outside on the stone steps, under the streetlights, a few people came up to her. She thanked them for coming. She told them the work was not over. She told them to watch the news in the morning. She said it calmly, the way someone says a thing they already know is true. At 6 o'clock the following morning, Nadia Cross's laptop sent the press release. It went to the city paper's newsroom, the 2 local television stations, 3 regional business publications, and the Associated Press regional desk. The subject line read, Achebe-Ward Community Development announces closing on 70% of Delmore Corridor Block. Community Land Trust and Mixed-Use Development moving forward. The body of the release was 4 paragraphs. It named the parcels. It named the purchase prices. It named the financing partners. 2 community development financial institutions and a regional bank that had committed to the project 8 months prior. It described the community land trust structure, the local business incubation component, and the affordable residential units. It included a quote from Simone. The quote read, "The Delmore corridor has been deferred for 11 years. The community has waited long enough. We are not asking the city for permission to invest in the East Side. We are already here." The release did not mention the council session. It did not need to. By 6:15, the reporter from the city paper, who had been at that session the night before, who had watched Gerald Pitt cut off a presenter mid-sentence and table her proposal without reading the application, had the press release in her inbox. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she pulled up her notes from the previous night and read the exact quote she had transcribed when Pitt leaned into his microphone. "Aspirational at best." She picked up her phone. Her editor answered on the second ring. "You need to see what just landed in the press inbox," she said. "The woman Pitt tabled last night? Her firm already owns the block." There was a silence on the other end of the line. "How much of it?" the editor asked. 70%. Closed 3 weeks ago." Another silence. "That's the front page," the editor said. It was. The headline ran above the fold. The story was, from a journalistic standpoint, almost perfectly constructed. Not because anyone had orchestrated it that way, but because the facts arranged themselves into a narrative that required almost no editorializing. A city councilman, on camera, in front of a packed chamber, had dismissed a development proposal as aspirational at best and moved to table it without reading the application. The developer presenting the proposal had, 3 weeks prior, closed on 70% of the block in question. The zoning he tabled was for her own property. The reporter had the council session transcript. She had the county recorder filings. She had the press release. She had her own notes from the chamber. She had also, by 7:30 that morning, reached Simone for a brief comment. Simone said, "We submitted a complete application 45 days ago. We were prepared to answer every question the subcommittee had. We remain ready to work with the city and the zoning designation. The community has been waiting 11 years. We're not going anywhere." That was her entire comment. The reporter had also reached Gerald Pitt's office. His communications director had issued a statement saying that the councilman looks forward to reviewing the complete application materials and working constructively with all stakeholders on responsible development in the East Side corridor. The statement did not address the fact that the application had been sitting in a binder at the dais for 45 days. By 9 o'clock that morning, the story had been shared several thousand times on social media. By noon, it had been picked up by 2 national outlets covering urban development and housing policy. By mid-afternoon, a prominent national publication covering race and economics had published a commentary piece under the headline, "The Delmore Corridor is a case study in what happens when you don't do your homework." The commentary named Pitt by name. It named the 14-year pattern of East Side proposals tabled or rejected. It named the 11 years on the deferred maintenance list. It named the 437 community signatures. Gerald Pitt did not issue a second statement that day. His nephew Raymond was photographed leaving the council building at 2 in the afternoon, looking at his phone with an expression that the television cameras caught and that the internet, with its particular efficiency, captioned in several creative ways. By 10 o'clock that morning, Nadia Cross had taken 11 calls. 3 were from journalists. 2 were from community organizations in other cities that had seen the story and wanted to talk. 1 was from a regional foundation that had been watching the East Side corridor for 2 years and wanted to discuss a potential grant. 1 was from a city council member, not Gerald Pitt, who represented an adjacent district and wanted to explore collaboration. And 1 was from a partner at a commercial real estate firm that had, in the previous year, submitted its own proposal for a portion of the Delmore corridor, a proposal that had sailed through Pitt's subcommittee in 6 weeks. That call, Nadia noted carefully in her legal pad, was the most interesting one. The commercial firm's partner had called to congratulate Simone on the acquisition and to explore whether there were partnership opportunities. The language was smooth and the tone was collegial. What the call actually was, Nadia understood immediately, was a recalibration. A firm that had not taken Achebe-Ward seriously as a market player, suddenly understanding that it needed to. She told the partner she would pass the message along. She did not tell him that Simone had anticipated exactly this kind of call and had a very specific answer prepared. Simone spent the morning not on media calls, but on the work. There were financing documents to finalize. There were conversations to have with the 4 remaining parcel owners on the block, including the barbershop owner, a man named Mr. Clifford, who had been in that building since 1987 and whose continued presence in the corridor was, as far as Simone was concerned, non-negotiable. There were her junior planners to brief on the revised timeline. There were the 437 community signatories who deserved to hear from her directly before they heard everything from a news article. She had scheduled a community meeting for the following Saturday. She had also, that morning, filed a formal request with the city clerk's office for a new hearing date before the zoning subcommittee, with a written request that the subcommittee chair confirm in advance that the application materials submitted 45 days prior had been reviewed. That request was also in the public record. The reporter from the city paper noted it in a follow-up item that afternoon. Gerald Pitt did not have a good week. This is worth saying plainly because the reckoning in this story did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrived the way most real reckonings arrive, in stages, each one adding weight to the one before, until the accumulated pressure became impossible to ignore. The first stage was the coverage. The front page story ran, the national pickup followed, the commentary pieces accumulated. By the end of the first week, Pitt's name was attached, in search results and in the public conversation, to the phrase, "didn't read the application," which is not, for a 9-year veteran of the zoning subcommittee, a comfortable association. The second stage was institutional. 3 city council members from other districts, including the one who had called Nadia that first morning, co-signed a letter to the council president requesting a review of the subcommittee's process for handling community development applications. The letter did not name Pitt directly. It did not need to. Everyone in the building understood what it was about. The council president's office acknowledged the letter and said a review would be conducted. The third stage was local. The neighborhood association in the East Side District passed a formal resolution calling on the subcommittee to schedule a new hearing on the Achebe-Ward application within 30 days. The resolution was signed by 11 community organizations. It was delivered to the council clerk's office in person by a delegation that included the older woman from the front row of the gallery, the one who had closed her eyes when the gavel came down. The fourth stage was the one that Pitt's staff had not anticipated. Raymond Pitt, the councilman's nephew and campaign treasurer, had, in the previous year, been part of a group that had quietly explored acquiring 2 parcels on the Delmore corridor for a private commercial development. The exploration had not gone far, and nothing had been purchased, but the inquiry had been made. And when the story of the Achebe-Ward acquisition broke and the corridor became front-page news, a property broker who had been involved in those preliminary conversations mentioned it. Not to a journalist, not formally, but in the way that things get mentioned in cities where everyone knows everyone. Within 10 days, a local investigative reporter was making calls. Gerald Pitt's office issued a statement saying the councilman had no personal financial interest in any East Side properties, and that any suggestion otherwise was categorically false and politically motivated. The investigative reporter kept making calls. The new hearing was scheduled 26 days after Gerald Pitt tabled the original proposal. Simone did not celebrate the scheduling. She went back to work. In the weeks between the first session and the second, she had done 3 things that mattered. She had met individually with each of the 4 remaining parcel owners on the block, including the barbershop owner, Mr. Clifford, who had listened to her full presentation over coffee in his shop on a Tuesday morning and had said at the end that he was glad somebody was finally doing something right. She had held the community meeting she had promised, a Saturday morning session that drew over 200 people, where she walked through the full development plan, answered every question, and made a commitment on the record that the barbershop would remain in the corridor for as long as Mr. Clifford wanted to be there. And she had submitted to the city clerk's office a supplemental application package, not because the original was deficient, but because she wanted the record to be complete beyond any possible challenge. The second hearing was different from the first in almost every way that mattered. The gallery was full again. The same 2 television cameras were there. The same reporter from the city paper sat in the press row. But the energy in the room was different. Not the charged, anxious anticipation of the first session, but something more settled. The community members who filled those seats had watched the week's events unfold. They had read the coverage. They had seen what happened when someone showed up with their work done and their dignity intact and let the facts do what facts do when they are given space. Gerald Pitt was not chairing the session. He had recused himself, citing a need to avoid any appearance of conflict given the ongoing review of subcommittee processes. His office had issued a statement to that effect 2 days prior. The chair for the session was a council member from the North Side District who had, in her 8 years on the council, approved 4 community development projects in disinvested neighborhoods. She had read the application. She said so on the record at the opening of the session. Simone was given 15 minutes. She used 12. She walked through the parcel acquisitions, the financing structure, the community land trust terms, the local business incubation program, the affordable residential units, the architectural plan, the infrastructure commitments, and the 31 modifications made based on community input. She answered 4 questions from subcommittee members, specific technical questions about the financing covenants and the land trust governance structure, with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this for 6 years and had spent the last 45 days waiting for someone to ask. When she finished, the acting chair looked down at the application binder, the same binder that had sat unopened at the previous session, and said, "This is a thorough application. I want to commend the applicant on the depth of community engagement documentation. I've rarely seen this level of resident input in a proposal of this type." She called for a vote. The zoning designation passed, 4-0. The gallery did not erupt this time either. It did something quieter and more lasting. It applauded, not the sharp, sudden applause of a surprise, but the steady, sustained applause of people who had been waiting a long time for something to go right and were allowing themselves, finally, to feel that it had. Simone stood at the podium and received it without performance. She nodded once to the acting chair. She turned and looked at the gallery, at the older woman in the front row who was not closing her eyes this time, and at the man beside her, and at the 200 other people who had come back to see this through. Nadia Cross, at the applicant table, wrote 2 words in her notebook. She did not underline them this time. She did not need to. Outside on the stone steps, in the late afternoon light, a reporter asked Simone what she wanted people to take from this story. She thought for a moment, not performing the pause, actually thinking. "That the work matters," she said. "Not the drama, not the reversal, the work. We did the work, the community did the work, and the work held. That's the story." She picked up her portfolio and walked to her car. 3 months later, ground was broken on the Delmore corridor. Mr. Clifford from the barber shop was at the ceremony. So were the 437 people whose names were in the portfolio. Gerald Pitt was not. The investigative reporter's story about Raymond Pitt's preliminary property inquiries ran 2 weeks before the groundbreaking. It did not allege illegality. There was none to allege. What it documented was a pattern. A subcommittee chair whose approval record in disinvested neighborhoods lagged dramatically behind his record in affluent ones, and a preliminary interest in a corridor that his subcommittee had jurisdiction over. The story raised questions it could not fully answer. The questions were enough. Pitt announced 6 weeks after the groundbreaking that he would not seek re-election. He cited a desire to spend more time with his family. The East Side had waited 30 years for someone to build something on that corridor. It had waited 11 years for a task force recommendation to go somewhere. It had waited 45 days for a subcommittee chair to open a binder. In the end, it did not wait for Gerald Pitt. It never needed to. If what just happened in that chamber hit you somewhere real, the dismissal, the binder that sat unopened for 45 days, the way she stood at that microphone and did not flinch, then you already understand why this channel exists. Stories like Simone's don't make the front page because someone got lucky. They make the front page because someone did the work when nobody was watching and held their composure when the room was watching. If that kind of story is what you come here for, the subscribe button is right there. And what comes next in this video is the part that made the reporter's editor say, "That's the front page." If you've stayed this far, you've watched a woman spend 6 years building something that a man tried to dismiss in 4 seconds. And you've watched the 4 seconds become the headline and the 6 years become the foundation. This channel tells these stories every week, the ones where dignity outlasts dismissal, the ones where the work holds. Subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of depth we bring every time. And the next one is already waiting. Gerald Pitt tabled a proposal he hadn't read, and the next morning, the whole city learned whose name was on the deed. Thanks for watching. The end screen has more stories like this one. Pick whichever video calls to you. Everyone on this channel was built for people who believe the truth arrives, even when it takes its time.